Welcome to Moonbeaming, a podcast about magic, creativity, the tarot, lunar living, and more. I'm your host, Sarah Faith Gottesdiener, and I'm so happy you're here. Hello and welcome to Moonbeaming. This is a space where we explore magic, spirituality, creativity, tarot, ethics, business, all through the lens of lunar living. If you're here for the first time, my name is Sarah Faith Gottesdiener. I'm your host. I'm also a psychic, a tarot reader, an artist, the author of the Moon Book, and a business owner. What can I say? I like to keep busy. And if you're a longtime listener, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you so much. But enough about me. What about you? How are you? You look great. You look good. You look fresh, if I do say so myself. Okay, babes. I am really excited for this week's episode because I got to speak with the fascinating, charming, and totally lovely Fran Tirado. Fran is an editor, a writer, a podcast host, and so much more. Apparently, Fran likes to keep busy too. We spoke about so many incredible topics in this episode: spirituality, purpose, self-love, making hard decisions, values. Fran shares about what it was like to grow up in an evangelical household and community, and then come out and leave his church and his faith as a teenager. He talks about choosing to work primarily for only queer causes, what led to it, and what's become of it once he decided. We talk about how queerness is a portal and how it informs our perspectives of spirituality. If you're questioning your faith, this episode is for you. If you want to learn how to love yourself more, hello, don't we all? I do. This episode is for you. If you're curious about how to put your values into practice, Fran really breaks it down for all of us. So, Moonbeamers, here is my conversation with Fran Tirado. I am so excited to have the most fantastic, fabulous, kind, sweet, ethical, awesome, cute, all of the things guest with me here on today's show. I have Fran Tirado. Welcome to Moonbeaming, Fran.
Ooh, it is actually a dream come true, not gonna lie. I mean, not to completely gush over you, but you know, your work and a lot of work of witches like you were really formative to, you know, my spiritual awakening. So it's really an honor. I'm so excited to be here, Sarah.
Awesome. So you just started right in with what I wanted to start right in with you, which is spiritual awakening. Can we talk about, do you want to share a little bit about your own personal spiritual awakening?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, I think a lot of queer people get like so bored with talking about like this upbringing story that is just excruciatingly common, especially depending on where you grew up. But I was raised in an evangelical Baptist household. My parents were extremely conservative, sheltered me from everything. I, you know, lived in what I would call like a cultural vacuum. Like I only listened to Christian music. We watched The Passion of the Christ every Easter. Like the shows that we watched as a family were like Little House on the Prairie and like, you know, things that were deep. Like I wasn't allowed to read Harry Potter. I had to read the first 4 Harry Potter books in secret. Like wasn't allowed to watch anything witch related, anything with sex, anything with. So, you know, that was kind of the backdrop of how I grew up. And I was drinking that juice. Like I was at church 2 to 3 times a week. I went on missions trips to the Czech Republic, Guatemala, Japan to try and save teens and bring them to Jesus. I was at Jesus camp 7 years in a row, was a Jesus camp counselor. I wanted to be a youth pastor when I grew up. And when I was around, I had always known that I was queer, but had assumed that it was something that I could pray away because that is just kind of how we're cultured and those kind of subsects of organized religion. And I think that when I was 17 or 18, I fell in love with someone in my high school. We started dating, and that was kind of my coming out. And, it's so funny because it's too easy to conflate spirituality and religion. But I do think that's something that's very common, especially when you're first coming into your own queerness, or rather, as I like to say, reunited with my queerness, a queerness that I had suppressed from childhood. And so it was the experience of leaving my faith was this most cinematic, aha moment. I was laying in a park with my then boyfriend, looking at the stars and thinking to myself, I just experiencing this bliss with him. And then thinking to myself, wait a second, God has kept me from this the whole time, which is obviously, not how I would think of God now, if I do think of God now. But at the time I was everything that I've been taught about religion has been in the interest of depriving me of something when I want to live the fullest possible life I can live. So in that moment, laying in the stars, I was just I don't believe in God anymore. It was that simple, which is kind of wild. And I don't think how a lot of people leave their faith. But anyways, to answer your question, when I decided that that was something that was no longer going to be a part of my everyday life, it took years to come back to a version of spirituality, which I kind of practice, I guess, today in a very different way.
Yeah, so there's a lot in what you just shared. And so I want to, if you don't mind, I want to just sort of follow up on some, because the first thing I thought of was this sharing, and I think it happens with so many queer people. And I'm paraphrasing this quote here. There was this great quote I love from James Cameron Mitchell, where he says, being queer was really the gateway for me to completely reinvent and reimagine my own belief system, because I'm okay, wait a minute. I'm queer. I love being queer. Being queer is who I am. I'm paraphrasing him. Well, what else have they lied to me about? What else is messed up that they've been what else is evil that's actually not evil? I'm not, so I think that there's this really interesting intersection between queerness and freedom, and queerness and imagination, once you fully understand and maybe can heal with some of the shame and the other kind of things that are put on queer people from a very young age around religion or around certain cultures, around heteronormativity. So I think that it's interesting that your belief system, queerness was sort of your portal into imagining a new belief system. And I'm curious as to what that belief system became or is, or, what kind of, what those beliefs are.
Yeah. I mean, you did kind of nail it on the head, that quote. And he is a behemoth of queer culture. And so that's the perfect point of reference. I don't know if this metaphor is totally right, but I think a lot about when I write about this, or when I'm talking about it in therapy, I've described before, the experience of leaving my faith was you've been sitting down to dinner for 17 years. You're eating the same meals, you're eating with the same people, you're kind of consuming this on a day-to-day and have never asked questions. And one day, you find out that the food has been a little bit poisoned this whole time. And that's why you've been chronically sick and tired. And what I had kind of experienced through my childhood and that upbringing was a self-hatred that really has poisoned my psyche and affects the way that I view myself today, still more than a decade later. And so that really resonates with me to think about queerness as an unlocking. I really think that queerness, transness, gender nonconformity is a superpower. I think that a lot of my work revolves around this idea that to be queer or to be trans is to hold an extraordinariness that then immediately connects you and makes you kindred to people that can help you find yourself. When I was 17, like, I could not have been more lost. I could not have had a worse sense of self. And just as you said, like, queerness is a portal. Like, that's so accurate. Like, what queerness cracked open for me was this understanding of that extraordinariness, and the fact that when you are othered and when your life is queered, you then have the freedom to make your own rules. Just as you said, it's like all the things that you were taught to do, to do or not to do, you then get to reevaluate all of that. And that's very much so what I did. Like, I went hard and fast in the other direction from my Jesus camp years.
Right. So you took a real step away from organized religion, from faith. You immersed yourself, I'm going to assume then, in queer culture, into, finding a culture that reflected you or that invigorates you. So what did it look like to start dipping your toe back into, in quotes, spirituality for you?
Yeah, it was honestly on accident. When religion, or rather, I guess spirit, the version of spirituality that I was doing in my childhood, takes up such a huge part of your life, for it to be gone in a second, there are ramifications to that, emotional ramifications, right?
It's traumatic.
Like, exactly. It was, yeah, it's just this complete like 180 of self. And it's like
it feels like it's a spiritual crisis. I also feel like you were in a crisis when when you decided, or was it both and? Was it like a liberation and some kind of existential?
It was, funny enough, it was, and this isn't every queer person's experience. I know a lot of queer people that still have hard times leaving their faith, that still are dealing with the ramifications of that shame or that attachment. My experience of leaving religion rather, was unbridled joy. It was definitely in crisis because the church communities around me performed cataclysms and interviewed me and asked me questions, and they tried to send me to conversion therapy and all of the kind of usual horror stories that you get out of like a coming out story in a church, in a fundamentalist church setting. But the experience of finding my spirituality again was a long time. It took a while. And that's in large part because when you're that young, it's too easy to conflate all of spirituality with the toxicity of a lot of organized religion. And so after years going by, I am feeling this kind of God-shaped hole in every fiber of my being. And I'm like, okay, what do I fill this with? And I'm not going to lie, Sarah, it's a combination of work like yours, work like my friend Chani, who's an astrologer, and I came into her work and really fell in love with astrology. My friend Michelle T, who released a book about tarot that was extremely formative to me, and I started practicing tarot. And then your work, of course, as well, was something that I started reading regularly and subscribing to and reading up on social media. And it was a really gradual but completely unexpected turn in how I was living my day-to-day life. And what I was finding was, because of the time I didn't have therapy available to me, long story short, work in queer media, which means that I'm extremely under-resourced and never have health insurance. And at the time, I had changed health insurance 7 times in 3 years. So I'd never found the opportunity to find primary care. So didn't have a therapist at this time. And so I'm looking for outlets to ground me, or things to help quell day-to-day anxiety and other stuff. And tarot really was that. And astrology really was that. And the kind of teachings of all the queer witches and, mystics in my life, I think played a big part in teaching me more about what was available to me.
So let's talk about, I want to talk about tarot. How do you work with the tarot in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I've only been practicing for a few years. And It started with a daily card. I read, consumed modern tarot by Michelle T, which if you are a queer person or person of color, I think is a really wonderful kind of deconstruction of, as you talk about on the pod all the time, the really hierarchical structures that are intrinsic to a lot of things within traditionalist symbology and tarot. And so Michelle breaking open the gendering of that was really helpful for my understanding of tarot. And kind of the queering of the cards was really helpful. And so I started pulling a card a day, every single day, and just sitting with it. And sometimes that card would speak to my day, and other times it didn't resonate. I'd be like, oh, okay, just think about this later. And got really used to that. And then, digging deeper into my birth chart and digging deeper into astrology, cracked open some of those things as well. But, for me, tarot is definitely a practice. I don't see tarot as, or rather, I don't practice tarot as a tool of like divination or fortune telling, or like, this is like what's going to happen in my life. I understand tarot as a practice that is supplementary to my therapy now, and a practice in storytelling and a practice in self-work. And what you see in the cards and what you pull, the meanings that you pull out of cards and things that resonate with you, is information that comes from your own personhood, And so I kind of think about it as prompts to get me through certain barriers or work through certain problems just by listening to my own psyche, I guess, and what's going through.
Yeah. So you're pretty consistent, it sounds like, in your spiritual practices.
Yeah, I am. I try to spend, I'm a bit of a workaholic, unfortunately. And so this isn't always true, but I try to spend like a moment in my mornings, like writing in my moon journal and drawing a card and sitting with like a moment that is not on my phone, or sitting with a moment that, is kind of divorced from the rest of the world. And tarot and things that come with it really do help me occupy that space, because I'm just someone who, if you give me free time, I'm going to fill it. And so I try to block off that free time.
You're a planner. She's a planner, baby, right?
I really am. Virgo moon. Taurus, Virgo moon. And so I'm like very organized. My Mercury is in Gemini. I'm like very just like constant communication, always scheduling, always planning. And it is actually my love language, to be honest. But yeah, that's definitely my style.
I understand. I have a Taurus rising and lots of Virgo myself. So I'm like, bring me the over communication, bring me the Google invite, let me know you're going to be there. I'm like, that all is totally what I need to feel good. So I totally hear that. So I guess I want to know now, what are some of your spiritual beliefs now, after kind of leaving, regrouping, creating your own practices that really speak to who you are and what you need? What are your beliefs now spiritually?
When I set out on this journey, I did have like I felt this big need to like define what it is that I believed in. And right now we're in a really tumultuous time for our belief systems. We're in a time wherein anything and everything that we have subscribed to needs to be put back in question, right? And so I definitely do have like my beliefs and things that I feel very strongly about. However, a lot of the things that I believe are still a work in progress. Even like my gender, and my identity, like that is like very whip, like an ongoing project, you know what I mean? And I think that, core belief systems is kind of part of that. Like I try to be open about like knowing as much about what I know, but, always being open to like new ideas, because especially in the last 5-6 years, so much of what I previously believed has changed. And I know that's true for a lot of people. But the core tenets of like, how I guess I go about my day and like what I want to like put out in the world start with this kind of idea that like queer people and trans people and Black people and brown people created pretty much like everything that mainstream culture considers like cool today. You know what I mean? And so a lot of my work and the work that I do with my friends and the organizers that I know is helping remind people of that fact, right? And within that, I believe that queerness is a power to be wielded. And when properly tapped, makes you reach an extraordinary potential that you wouldn't have otherwise reached. And that within that communal dreaming is so powerful for marginalized communities. So when you do tap into that power, you then tap into chosen families and a futurity that we can like build together. And that on top of that we deserve joy in the face of adversity. And also just joy not even in spite of anything, just like joy, period. You know what I mean? So I think those kind of things are my beliefs.
Yeah, they're beautiful and I love them. So you kind of brought something up that I wanted to talk about, which is this idea of queer spirituality or queer mysticism. And I was hoping you could share some of your thoughts around the intersections of queerness, spirituality. Maybe you're just speaking from your own experience, but I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it definitely is just for my experience. This might not be for everybody. You know, I think it starts with completely dismantling the ways that we think that spirituality and or religion then means that you need to be perfect, or then means that you need to be this kind of crystal clear picture of morality, or even in a time completely divorced of Christianity, where we are all evaluating and trying to hold hard onto our ethical centers, right? I think for me, like the queering of a belief system starts with kind of ridding yourself of the need to adhere specifically to a finite set of rules, right? And so, you know, fluidity is actually a big part of that journey. And moving in and out of like belief systems, I think is like a big part of like, I guess, how I go about that. I got completely lost in like what I was trying to say. Will you say the question again?
I know exactly what you're saying. We're talking about queerness and spirituality, queer mysticism, queering spirituality, whatever you want to kind of, however you want to sort of talk about that. And what I hear you saying is really queering is antithetical to so many of the religions and practices that we have been indoctrinated into, where they want resolution, hierarchical systems, bad or good, yes or no, you know, so on and so forth. And there's this real, I think, awakening for so many people to understand that resolution and reconciliation isn't the goal. Like, you know, the goal is not to be pure or perfect. The sacred is profane as much as it is transcendental. Like there is no there. We're not going anywhere. So there's nowhere to kind of, you know, because there's this intersection, obviously, of white supremacy, colonization, capitalism within spirituality, of course, where we're just on this hamster wheel of trying to get better or trying to become more perfect or less bad or whatever. And when we're queering it, I mean, first of all, we're taking away the binary, which completely eradicates and decimates so much of like heteronormative spirituality, which is like the divine feminine and divine masculine. It's like, well, actually, there are many genders. Genders are not linked to our bodies, you know, and so it blows that duality open, you know, so it becomes more of a spectrum. And it's not an either or, it's sort of like I think of it as a spiral. You know, a lot of my work is lunar, so I think about it as moving on in spirals instead of sort of on and off and those sorts of things. But I think actually queerness is really integral to having a spiritual belief system that is fluid and that is adaptable, as you say, Fran, because we are in this time where we are having to really question all aspects of our existence. You know, because it's the water we breathe. So it's like we're both kind of dismantling and unpacking any hierarchies or systems of punishment within ourselves so that we can guide other folks if they'd like, you know, to kind of get a little bit more open. And I think that like queerness and spirituality and applying queerness to spirituality and also queerness as a spiritual practice is definitely one way to help do that.
Exactly. You're saying exactly what I'm kind of feeling in this space. And like, yeah, to my, like the fluidity part of that, like the kind of queerness of fluidity in your belief system is like so important, because rigidity is what got us in trouble in the first place. These systems that have been held for so long is because no one ever put them into question, right? And so I guess like to kind of flip it on the other side, it's so important to, when we, especially to kind of like the queer godless heathens listening to this podcast, to people who are really, or people who are listening and they're really surefire in the ethics systems that they're in right now, particularly in this time of this like cultural attention to what's right and wrong, that, you know, there is kind of a punitiveness to all of it that is getting really icky. And it's a punitiveness based in, and I'm not going to talk about cancel culture, but obviously I'm alluding to that. But it's like, it's a punitiveness that is grounded in a rigidity. And I think what a lot of, I'm saying queer and trans people just because that's my community, but I think that a lot of people just with fierce ethics systems should realize is that when we weaponize our belief systems and we turn them onto other people, regardless of whether or not that person really deserves it, because a lot of times they deserve it, that we are replicating the exact same oppressive systems that we were trying to combat in the first place. And so within all of that, it's so important for us to continue to be fluid and to listen to each other and to be open to the fracturing of and the breaking open of the things that we believe.
A woman, a them, amen. Yes. Love it. I love it. So I want to switch gears a little bit and I want to talk about another. I love that. Like when I thought of topics thought about topics I'd love to discuss with you, they're like really big. Like they're really like, what are the big things here? Spirituality, purpose, identity, you know, all these things. But but these are kind of the corner, like you think about these big things on a daily basis. Yeah.
I do, unfortunately, for better or worse.
It's good though. I think it's good. So you're the right person to talk to about purpose. So you strike me as someone who has strong motivations, strong values, strong visions. Of course, obviously they change and they mutate and they grow, but like they feel very front and center to a lot of the actions that you do and a lot of who you are. So I was hoping, you know, how did you come to sort of be motivated by these value systems that you have? You know, what are some of those? Like, has this just always been innate to who you are since you were a little baby? Like, you know, am I incorrect in saying this, or am I sort of correct?
You are, I mean, yeah, you are a little correct. Like I went to my first protest when I was in like 3rd or 4th grade, like, and it was for something stupid. Like my parents were like, you know, bringing me along to like picket the placement of like some sort of really disruptive, like water tower placement in our neighborhood that we were opposed to because it was, I don't remember why, but like that was my first protest. And I do have like a weird relationship with my biological family, but my parents really did teach me to stay true to what I believe in and to fight for what I believe in. And I'm really grateful for that. But yeah, I mean, I've been working in queer and trans spaces, queer and trans storytelling and media for a decade now. And it started with me applying for a job at the local newspaper. It was a daily newspaper that I was at the office of every single day. I probably got paid like 10 cents an hour when it came down to like the amount of hours I clocked there. But I had a column on queer issues where I was going to school in Indiana. And that was the beginning of what I didn't know then, but understand now as us taking a stab at advocacy work and believing in something. Because I would get on my platform and talk about the things that I cared about. And from there, I guess, really concretized like what I believe is my life's purpose. And I try to be careful when I talk about purpose in general, right? Because as someone who like my work is like the most life-giving thing that I do, you still need a work-life balance, right? And we can't conflate our worth with like the ways that we make money or the ways that we like, move about the world. But, I really have always been like this. Like when I was in college and I would be in Shakespeare class, I would like write an essay that was like, Antonio and Sebastian were gay for each other. In this essay, I will, you know what I mean? Or like I would be in Chaucer and I'd be like, Troilus was into like butt stuff. And it was a BDSM relationship. And like I could only be interested in something unless I queered it. And then did advocacy work throughout college, came to New York, was only interested in working in queer stuff. Took on a lot of different jobs in podcasting and magazine spaces, different media roles, all the while within the interest of like serving queer and trans communities in some way and amplifying their stories. It definitely became my full-time scenario, like maybe a year before Trump got elected, like around his, like, I guess, campaign was like a really torturous time for obviously all of us, but especially my communities. And I was not, making money doing the thing that I loved. And so I took a job at an ad agency and I was just sitting there like writing ads for like Smart Water and like writing copy for Old Navy and like feeling the soul being sucked out of my body. And then looking at news about Trump and being like, wait, anything that I'm doing that is not in service to the marginalized communities that keep me up at night, that I'm always thinking about, anything not serving that is wasted time. And I literally quit my job because I couldn't do things that weren't queer anymore.
That's amazing. That was like the moment you decided. So I'm wondering what you would say now, because I believe our purpose changes and I believe we have many purposes actually that can change really on a dime. But I'm wondering now, what would you say one of your purposes is?
That's a great question. I mean, first and foremost, it's to do the best I can to help cultivate deeper storytelling and multiplicity of perspective for queer and trans communities. Because right now, queer media, it's definitely having a boom, but we're still eons behind what cishet people have been doing since the dawn of time, right? And so they've had all the opportunity to create nuanced characters, to create new stories, to make tons of mistakes. They now have the liberty to be completely average, right? Oh gosh, I'm trying to think of like a mediocre celebrity that is like still making movies like over and over again.
Like all of them?
Yeah, I would know. I'm sure literally any of them. They're still making movies, and queer and trans people have not been afforded the ability to be average, especially in, mainstream media, have not been afforded the opportunity to create nuances, to make mistakes, to have character, to experience like villainy, queer mediocrity, queer people sitting on a park bench and just minding their own business. You know what I mean? Like that to me are the things and the stories that I'm excited about. I'm excited about a queer trans Sex in the City, or a story about like a gender non-conforming villainess, like villainix, you know what I mean? Like these kinds of things that to me is like my life's purpose is creating a completely untapped class of stories that have gone on the sidelines for so long.
What do you think? Because I think about this a lot, right? In my own life. So much of the reason why I created my own business wasn't because I wanted to work for myself, or wasn't because I had dreams of being a business person. Like I actually just like it. I mean, I'm an artist. But what happened was I was in all of these spaces that I didn't create. And I just, similar to you, it wasn't that I was like, I need to do all queer stuff, but I was like, I am over and over again in these spaces that abuse me, that extract me, where I'm never getting paid what the white dude next to me is getting paid. I'm not treated the same way. I'm usually the smartest person in the room, but I'm treated like I'm the stupidest, and on and on and on. And I was like, I need to like scoot. So that's actually how it wasn't really that I was like, oh, I want to just be an entrepreneur and like get into this. And it wasn't anything like that. It was really like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't, like you, I was like physically, emotionally, mentally, like I actually can't do this anymore because I love myself and I don't want to be around people who treat me with disrespect or worse. My question is sort of like, what are your thoughts on queer people, marginalized people creating their own companies, creating their own, because I feel like, isn't there this thing that happens where when queer folks try to enter a room that was not created for them, that there's, you know, there's still all of this abuse and all of this extraction that they have to fight in addition to just trying to make stories about joy or share narratives around queer mediocrity or just silly rom-coms or whatever it is. Like, what are your thoughts on queer folks creating their own spaces and or like working within larger systems?
It really depends on who you are, right? I don't think the gig economy is for everybody. I mean, I mean, you can attest, it's like fucking hard. You know what I mean? Especially when you're just starting. You do have to cultivate a body of work and a lot of trial and error before you get to that spot. So, you know, to the point of like queer and trans people, marginalized people creating their own ventures, their own businesses. I'm always going to advocate for it, but I will also say it's a lot easier said than done. And especially when we are surrounded by success stories, right? Especially if you live in New York City or if you live in Los Angeles. I can't remember who gave me this metaphor, but one time someone described me the experience of living in New York or LA as like the experience of being in a casino. Like you are in an airless, lightless space and you're sitting there pulling the crank, cha-chunk, cha-chunk, cha-chunk. Am I going to make it? Am I going to make it? Is this going to be my success story? And all around you are the dings and the bells and the whistles of everyone else's success, and which is amplified by social media. And that's a really, really tough place to be in because you can't help but compare your work to others. And so I would say that it's really important to create something that is wholly your own and to have a metric for your own success that is not comparable to others and probably should not be extremely attached to, you know, money or notoriety or all those things. You know, this job, this kind of like being full-time homosexual, like full-time faggot, for lack of a better word, it's like that is a job I've done for $13,000 a year. And that is a job that I've done for well into six figures. And it has never mattered to me what I do make, so long as I get to do what I love. And I think if you find that thing, then you are on the right path. But on the second half of your question, institutional labor, I still think has its values. If you want to work within the company, within the system to create change, you know, I'm the girl that does a lot of that stuff, that has done it for companies like the Netflixes and the Googles, the Microsofts, the Squarespaces, like all of the evil tech companies out there. Like I've worked within those systems to see what I can change. And I'm not going to pretend like I have ultimate clarity on where the value is and where you can go right and where you can go wrong when playing the dangerous game of institutional labor or capitalism in general. But I do know that there is, so long as we are living within capitalism and are forced to participate in it, there is value in learning how to work those systems from within if you believe in yourself a lot.
So is defining success for you personally getting to do what you love most of the time?
It's definitely, yeah. Success has a lot to do with autonomy and getting to do what I love the most of the time. And also, my biggest success metric is what my community is saying about me. I feel, you know, big Taurus, I'm a Taurus, big Hierophant energy, right? I have like a big Jupiter placement. I don't actually know where it is. If Channy is listening to this podcast right now, she's probably screaming my Jupiter placement like into the air. But I can't remember. But like I have like this bigness in my sense of purpose and like, what I bring to the table and what I believe in. My success metric always comes down to, am I making the people that I am serving proud? Am I bringing them joy? I think joy is a big metric for me. If I can bring that to not just audiences on the macro, but the people that I talk to on a day-to-day in the micro, my family, like my non-biological family, if those people are coming back to me and saying, hey, we're really proud of you. Hey, that's amazing that you did that. That to me is the only thing that matters.
That's so beautiful. And yes, indeed, that is like core Hierophant energy right there. So personally, like what has been a really big challenge to that success?
I mean, money. Capitalism is like the biggest reckoning that I had last year. I had kind of pegged myself. And the reason I'm trying to be as open as possible about the fact that like I'm in this, questioning phase of my belief systems is because like last year, March, April, May, June, and everything that happened during those months of 2020, I had really pegged myself as this kind of corporate gay, as someone who was working inside institutions and doing really great work that I'm really proud of, work that gets hundreds of thousands of dollars to nonprofits and organizing efforts and movement work that gets tons and tons and tons of queer and trans people hired, getting them to work on their craft and get paid really well for it. And then the ability to tell incredible stories through these institutions and the resources that they provide. But then in May and June, realizing that no matter where you are within that system, you're still within the system. And so I don't talk about this a lot, but like a big part of my career change last year was feeling like my work has only ever been in service to a community. And when I work full-time at a company, it is in service to a community, but ultimately is in service to a corporation, no matter where you are within that corporation. And so I had a really hard time reconciling that and figuring out what it is I wanted to do with my life if the thing I had done all the way up until that point was ultimately feeding a system that is harming marginalized people. And I don't have the answer to that, but it is definitely the biggest obstacle that I reach in navigating how I take on jobs now and what I decide to work on and where I put my energy. But it is also really, I guess, clarifying to, know that I want to say no more and hopefully never work for a company again.
I mean, that's sort of that thing. It's this like wisdom of no escape. It's this like radical acceptance of what is. And it's also, I think that, I'm making an assumption. So please correct me if I am incorrect. I just have a feeling that you're pretty hard on yourself. Like I have a feeling that you're like your toughest critic, And as someone who has similar inclinations in recovery deeply around that, I think it's also important for us to understand that we are responsible for certain things and that there's an edge or a bandwidth to our responsibility. We are just one human being and we can't completely change the system. We need one another to change systems. And what we can and can't do, I feel like a lot of times I will witness myself or other folks putting other people on pedestals or being like, well, why did you make this choice? Or why are you working with this person? And the fact of the matter is that like we do live in this much larger system that I believe can change and hopefully will change in our lifetime. I'm not sure, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be working and having conversations like this in order to kind of, to shift things. But I think it's like also just realizing, hey, like this is what I can do. This is what I can't do. Like only you know what your bank account looks like. And, no one else is paying those bills. So for me, I'm like, well, I have my own little list of checks and balances for me internally. I have my own non-negotiables of like what I will not do, even if there's like a $10,000 check attached to it or whatever, And so I was sort of wondering if you have your little your own little Fran's like non-negotiables that you're like, no,
That's a great question. I mean, my biggest non-negotiables, I mean, one, I do have like a project minimum. I think that's something that took a while for me to instate, because when you're a marginalized person, whether it's you're Black or brown, or whether you're a woman, or whether you're queer or trans, like we devalue ourselves. That's what we've been cultured to do. And so I can no longer take a project for $200. You know what I mean? And so as capitalist as that sounds, it like having a kind of minimum is really important. But the exceptions to, I do unpaid labor every day, all the time. And that I do exclusively for queer and trans people that are not at institutions. I am always, it is like my ultimate love language. And I am always, always, always picking up calls, FaceTimes, emails, texts for queer and trans people that say, hey, I got cast into this campaign. How much should I charge them? Or, hey, I need help applying for this grant. Can you help me figure out how to get this money? Or, hey, I need help like launching this thing. Can I bounce an idea off of you? Hey, I'm working on this screenplay. Do you have a second idea? Like, I am doing that every day for the queer and trans people that I love, the queer and trans people that I call home, or that, you know, have fed me and helped me stay on my path. Like, it is so life-giving to me to give those kinds of acts of service to people for free. So I guess that's kind of a big part of like, I guess the exceptions and the checks and balances that you make. But in terms of like the non-negotiables for projects, a lot of it has to do with making sure that there is a nonprofit partner with it, or an organization that it is then feeding in perpetuity, so that it's servicing a community, even when companies are, you know, obviously servicing their own products, their own like financial gain. If they're also helping a community, like I can get on board with that. But the other thing is that I always bring people with me. So I with all my projects, will never be the only queer person in the room. I will always go into a project and I'll say, hey, you should hire my friend Tyler. Hey, you should hire my friend Raquel. Oh, let's bring like Devin Norell into this. Oh, let's like, you know, call Meredith, or let's call Eliel. Let's call, like, I'm always, always, always calling the people that I also know that are also in the gig economy to bring them with me and to get them paid as well, because multiplicity of perspective is so important. And that I cannot answer to, you know, if someone wants me to help create a campaign around Black trans lives, like that's something that I can coordinate. That's something that I can do the grunt work for, but it's not something that I can speak to. And so that is when I'm always, always bringing in other voices.
I love that. So I wanted to kind of close with a few last topics I really wanted to speak with you on. And one is this practice I have witnessed you doing publicly of self-love, of, you know, you sort of, really embracing compassion and dignity and adoration of self, which of course is very Venusian, you know, and also actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's very Hierophant, because the Hierophant is the vessel and our bodies are the vessel for our souls, our spirits, what we channel, how we enact our purpose or our beliefs in the world. And so I was hoping that you could share a little bit about why you decided to invest so strongly in self-love practices, like what you did, like how you've transformed. I'd really like personally, and I'm sure all of our listeners would love to hear a little bit about this.
I appreciate that. And thank you for taking notice. I really, I'm proud of that fact. Everybody who listened to this podcast can probably guess that, like, I spent the first 18 years of my life hating myself, not just punishing myself for my desire, but I was also like bullied profusely, like really grew up a loser, like bottom of the barrel in like the hierarchy of my high school of like 4,000 kids, bottom of the barrel. And so that really, really, really was hard on how I see myself, because it's been conditioned to me in so many different ways, not just in a religious way, but in like a social way, in a way that is like related to my ethnicity and the fact that I went to a predominantly white high school. And I feel like what I'm doing now is making up for lost time. I feel like any sort of energy that I put out into the world where I'm saying, hey, I'm the best, I'm fucking great, this is how gorgeous I look today, this is how much I'm going to love on myself, this is why I'm going to submerge into a bubble bath and why I deserve it. Indulgences and joy are things that I evangelize. And I think that it's such a necessary part of the healing that every marginalized person needs to do. And last year specifically, it was like a really big turning point, to be honest. I'll guess what I'll say is, long story short, I still have a really, really, really negative, or was holding onto a really negative image of myself. I experienced a lot of dysphoria. I experienced a lot of dysmorphia and have never really liked what I look at when I look in the mirror. And this year, with therapy and with a new practice in how I see myself and how I am kinder to myself, it's kind of the first time where I look in the mirror and I actually like what I see. Like, this is literally the first year out of my redacted number of years that I've been living in this life where I do like how I look. And that is only because I practiced self-love. When you say to yourself over and over again, like, I love myself, I love myself, I love myself, 9 times out of 10, you don't believe it. Like, I didn't believe myself when I did try to love myself. But when you do it over and over again, it is a skill set that you learn. Yeah.
I want to hear about the practices, because you're like, this is a practice, you tried to do it every day. Like, what did you discover about what Fran's love languages are? And were there a couple of moments, I can repeat this, but I just wanted to remember so I don't forget. Were there a couple of moments where you're like, oh, this is starting to sink in? Like, I'm starting to actually change. I have a different feeling about myself. So the question was, like, what were some of the practices that worked for you? And were there kind of some moments where you're like, oh, this is working, this is changing, if you can share?
Yeah, obviously therapy is a given. This last year was the first time I'd ever had a regular therapist. So that played a huge part. I think it is a combination of the massive amount of time we had to spend with ourselves last year, whether we liked it or not. You really had to sit with yourself. And the process of that, of looking in the mirror all the time, of trying to see yourself in different lights and different ways, and trying on different clothes, and trying on new genders, trying on new expressions, trying on things that work for you, I think was really just a slow unraveling. When I'm in like workaholic mode, I'm working like 90-hour work weeks. I don't have time to look in the mirror. And in a lot of ways, that's a defense mechanism to never examine myself. And that was another big realization of last year, is like, I realized that I work so much in small part because I'm trying to avoid myself. And so last year, when I was reconciling with, oh, this selfhood that you have put on the back burner, it's now on the front burner because you have nothing else to work on. And so that was a big part of last year. And those practices can look like, taking a bubble bath, as I do a lot. I try to put my phone away and take a bath and be with myself. It is looking in the mirror, which is really scary and weird. And it also sounds very like Lion King, like divorcee self-help book. Like I know that there's, it sounds very bizarre to be like something that has actually healed me. And this is not an exaggeration. And I realize how cliche this is. Something that has literally healed me has been the practice of like getting stoned and turning on music that I love and looking at myself in the mirror and dancing and seeing how my body moves and seeing a version of yourself that you haven't really looked at before. And I think that sounds kind of like, even as I say it, it like sounds like totally like arrogant and self-centered. And don't get it twisted. Like, I am very self-involved and like narcissistic sometimes. So like, I'm not going to pretend like that's not true. But this practice of like getting in touch with your selfhood is really just a challenge to look at the things that you don't like to look at, because I really didn't like looking at myself. And so I would kind of turn off my defense mechanisms with, I mean, the medicine that is cannabis, and try to probe at what I was uncomfortable with. And then on top of that, obviously, just like nourishment and eating a lot more and going to the gym and doing things that make you feel good in your body, going on walks, like all that stuff.
I love that. I love it. It doesn't sound self-centered to me because I think so many of us are actually afraid to look at ourselves. I think that for so many of us who've been programmed to hate ourselves from all the different reasons that are basically attacking us at all sides, if we are like a human living in the world, you know, I think it actually, to me, what you're describing is like a coming home to your body and also an intimacy, like a compassionate intimacy and awareness with yourself, where you are able to appreciate yourself in a way that is through your own gaze, you know, like through your own eyes. And in that is a reclaiming, which I find really gorgeous. So the last question I have for you, my dear, is for any listeners out there who are trying to figure out their life purpose, or maybe what one of their purposes are now, what advice do you have for them?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I guess it starts with like really desiring yourself, right? Like to the effect of like what you were saying earlier. I think a lot of times when we look at ourselves, especially when it comes to like romantic or intimate spaces, especially if you're in queer culture, in gay culture, like the way we conflate like how we are desirable or how we are valuable or how we are fuckable or what have you can really distort like how we view ourselves. And so I think that it kind of starts with desiring yourself, desiring your purpose, and listening to the things that you believe in, and actually believing in it is like a big part of that. But a lot of that starts with pretending to be the person you want to be until you are that person. You know, I feel like Cary Grant or Lady Gaga or whoever has like a version of that quote that's like maybe more eloquent than the way I'm putting it. But like, it really is a matter of like, if you want to be a star, when you walk into the coffee shop, you will conduct yourself like a fucking star. And you don't need anyone else in your life to do that. You don't need other people's constraints or prerequisites of value in order to see yourself as valuable, especially in a romantic way. You know, I think getting rid of like my desire to like have a boyfriend or have a partner, or that my value is based on who I sleep with, because that's a very, you know, queer thing. Getting rid of that was essential. And like looking at like my models for personhood, my favorite models for personhood as people that are so sure of themselves, like the Eartha Kitts or the Jane Fondas or like a Tracy Ellis Ross or like Fran Lebowitz, like people that are on their own and completely satisfied with that. I think that really starts with talking to yourself about, you know, whether you trust your own, I guess, value and worth. Yeah. And then pretending until you get it.
I love it. These are the steps. It's like 1, start to desire yourself and be curious. 2, define your own worth on your own terms. 3, act accordingly. Yeah. There we have. We have a blog. We have your little checklist. It has been such a pleasure to get to spend time with you. You are a light and a joy, and I am so appreciative of your openness, your honesty. I know everyone listening is as well. Fran, we will put all of this in the show notes, but you need to share where folks can find you, follow you, hire you, all of the things.
Of course, yeah. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Fran Squishco, on all social media platforms. If you would just search my name, Fran Tirado, I'll come up. If you want to hire me, you know, my email is in the social media bios of those platforms. So you can or you can slide into the DMs. I do respond to some biz DMs sometimes. And then, yeah, I also co-host a podcast called Food for Thought. That is, you know,
I love it. Such a good podcast.
Thank you. It's a panel.
We didn't even talk about it.
I know. Well,
what's your pod? Talk about your pod a little bit, just for 1 second. It's such a great podcast.
I appreciate that. It's just a panel of, you know, writers from different backgrounds, queer and trans writers from different backgrounds, talking about sex and relationships and literature, accountability, justice, like everything that's kind of relevant to queer and trans people. But it's very sexy. It's very horny. We answer a lot of relationship questions in a roundtable discussion format. And it's food for thought spelled THOT, a very important distinction. And that's all on our social media as well. And you can find us on any podcast app.
And your awesome newsletter.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. I actually have been working really hard on it. So I appreciate you. I probably totally would have forgotten to shout it out, but you can find my weekly newsletter, which I call the Joy Digest. It's just a list of things that have brought me and the people in my life joy that week. Anything from, links to articles that you can read, videos that you want to watch, events that are coming up, to, the bath products that I like, the lingerie that you could buy. So it's like a range of things that you can buy and a lot of things that are free, or TV shows to stream, stuff like that. It's just a very esoteric kind of mishmash of things that I love. But you can find that at fransquishco.substack.com. Or also the link is in my social media bios.
Yay. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. I love talking to you.
Love talking to you too. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Wasn't that lovely? It was so lovely. Thank you so much for listening, my dears. That's this week's episode. There's so much in what Fran shared. Am I right? Hopefully you're inspired, you're fired up, you're thinking about how you're going to connect with your own practices of self-love. A huge thanks to Fran for their energy, time, vulnerability, transparency, and for all the work that you continue to do on behalf of our queer community. It's really remarkable, and you inspire me every day. So give Fran a follow, subscribe to their newsletter, check out their podcast. All the links are in the show notes. And that's it. Until next week, everyone. Bye for now. Moonbeaming is brought to you by The Moon Studio. It is created and hosted by me, Sarah Faith Gottesdiener. It is edited by the incredible Caitlin George Parker. Additional support is by Stella Hartman. Music is by Will Owen and myself. If you like this podcast, you can support us by going to Patreon.com/The Moon Studio and becoming a patron. You can give this podcast 5 stars wherever you listen and also subscribe. We'd love it if you could let 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more friends know about us, and we accept all good vibes. Thanks so much for supporting us. Witches on planet Earth, not flying off to